Myanmar's many ethnic rebel groups are split on whether to step in to support the protesters as the violence widens to draw in border areas. Protesters opposing Myanmar's junta rule are calling on the many rebel groups to join in the fighting as the military escalate their iron fist against civilians.
This Thai village is on heightened alert after airstrikes just over the border in Myanmar forced thousands to flee and raised the fear of armed clashes, following an escalation in the military's crackdown on anti-coup protesters. Jumi, who runs a restaurant in Thailand's northern Mae Hong Son province, says if something happens, they were told to grab their bags and escape.
They have been drilled by the authorities and assistant village chief, teaching the villagers what they should do.
Fighting has flared in recent days between the army and rebel forces in the east and north. Myanmar has 24 or so ethnic armed factions, and they control vast swathes of the country. Most agreed ceasefires in recent years. But now many anti-coup protesters want them to join forces and take on the ruling junta. Yord Serk is a Myanmar rebel general from a group called the Restoration Council of Shan State. At his base in Chiang Mai, northern Thailand, he agrees with the protesters that the groups must form a federal army.
If the ethnic armed group's ideology is to protect their own people and the country, they should no longer be able to just stand by and do nothing. We now have one common enemy. We need to join hands and work together.
Other groups are reluctant. Back in Mae Hong Son, Khu U Ray of the Karenni National Progressive Party says the Myanmar military could use the involvement of rebel groups to its advantage.
The police and the army.
It might encourage soldiers and police to more violence, he says, and they could accuse us of being behind it. Thailand has been accused of helping the Myanmar military. On Monday, it denied turning back thousands of refugees. And in early March, the Thai army denied sending sacks of rice to Myanmar military units across the border.
A monitoring group in Myanmar says that the number of people killed since last month's coup has passed the 500 mark. The Assistance Association for Political Prisoners confirmed at least 510 deaths, but warned that the real figure was probably much higher. For more on the humanitarian crisis in Myanmar, we're now joined via Zoom by Linda Lakhdhir, who's a Human Rights Watch legal advisor, Asia Division. Linda, thanks very much indeed for joining us. Good to talk to you again. The last time we spoke, the coup and the protests were in their early days. It's showing no signs of abating, and sadly, hundreds of lives have been lost. What are you hearing and what are you seeing?
What we're seeing is a military and security forces that have essentially declared war on the people of Myanmar. They are acting with intense brutality. It's not only the deaths, over 500 deaths, but there have been many injuries, many people beaten and shot and, tortured in custody. There's the level of violence that is being essentially unleashed upon the civilian population by the military is truly appalling. At this point, there are over 35 children, some as young as 6, who have been confirmed killed by the military in the course of this, some killed in their own homes. So it is a truly appalling show of brutality and inhumanity by the military forces against a population that is incredibly determined, it appears, to continue to fight despite the violence on it by the military.
Is what we're seeing on a level that could be dealt with at the International Criminal Court, do you think? I mean, are we looking at that level of catastrophe?
Potentially. You are potentially looking at a systematic attack, a widespread and systematic attack on a civilian population by the military. I don't know there's a firm yet, but that is definitely something that is a possibility here.
So now we're hearing that the rebel groups are considering joining in the fray. And I guess the fear is once you have guns fighting back against the military, a civil war will kick off.
That would definitely be an intensification of the conflict if you start having the ethnic armed groups fighting back. I mean, you have had both the Kachin Independence Army and the KLA have both overrun some Tatmadaw bases in the last few days. So there has been, pushback by some of the ethnic armed groups, but they are not really a match in terms of personnel or weaponry for the Myanmar military. So I think that the involvement of them on a fighting basis is going to be a recipe for bloodshed on a massive scale.
Let's talk a little bit about these ethnic groups, because that has been part of the challenge in Myanmar that even found Aung San Suu Kyi on the wrong side of perhaps conventional wisdom and conventional thinking, that you have these ethnic groups, particularly in these border areas, that were persecuted even before this military coup.
Many of the ethnic groups in Myanmar have essentially suffered under the military since independence in many ways. There was a hope when the country first became independent that there would be a federal union where there would be some autonomy for the various groups, most of whom are in the borders of the country, which happen to be, in many cases, the much resource-rich parts of the country. But the truth has been that the military has persecuted the ethnic groups in many of these areas for decades. And what is happening now in Yangon and Mandalay is something that is sadly familiar to many of the ethnic groups in Myanmar.
So what can happen? I mean, what needs to happen? Because it seems as if this resistance is not going anywhere. 500 plus lives lost, but the people are not pulling back from the streets. It's almost as if it's now or never to deal with the military once and for all.
I mean, the international community needs to really step up here. There needs to be concerted, committed action on the part of the international community to make clear to the junta that it cannot stand. And really, the only thing that seems to have any impact on them is cutting off their access to money. So one of the real things that needs to happen is you need to have more sanctions on military-owned businesses. You need to have sanctions on the gas sector, which is where they derive huge amounts of revenue. You need to crack down on the money that they get often illicitly from gems and timber and other extractive industries. You need to cut off their money supply. And the world has to work together to do that. If only one or two countries do it, you won't cut off their supply enough to make them think twice. But you need to cut off their money supply. You need to have a global arms embargo so that no one is sending this military the bullets and other weapons that they are currently using against their own population. So you've had some steps taken. The United States has sanctioned 2 large military conglomerates, Mech and Mel. The United Kingdom has sanctioned one of those 2. The EU has not acted on that. And the UN itself has not imposed UN-based sanctions. There's more that can, and it needs to be done urgently, because if we get to the point where the ethnic armed groups start essentially fighting back on a major scale, at that point, it's not clear what the international community can do to bring this to a halt.
I would imagine that, I guess, for a real turning point to happen, China has to join the rest of the international community in absolutely condemning what's going on.
That would definitely be a very helpful step. China, but also Russia. Russia is another problem. Russia is on the Security Council. It has been joining China in bloc action on the Security Council. Russia has recently said it wants, as recently as last week or the week before, said it's to increase its military ties with Myanmar. So they are sort of stepping into this fray, in part, I think, because China is of 2 minds about what's happening there, because China has a lot of money invested in Myanmar that is at risk with this instability. Russia really doesn't, but Russia is a major arms supplier for Myanmar. So, Russia and China both came to the Armed Services Day parade and events held on Saturday But I think, at this point, in a way, Russia is almost more of a problem. But you need those countries to be under pressure from the rest of the world to say that this cannot go on. You cannot have the Myanmar military slaughtering its own people in the streets.
I mean, you're a legal advisor to Human Rights Watch, so the law is something that you understand. And I just wonder, there must be international laws that have been broken for the military to be shooting its own citizens. At what point, what law that should kick in so that the UN or somebody does something in Myanmar?
Well, I mean, there's various different issues you can look at. One is you can determine whether or not, in fact, what they're committing, if it's a widespread and systematic attack on a civilian population, it is arguably a crime against humanity, which is an international crime that can be prosecuted in the International Criminal Court. It can be prosecuted in any country that under a theory of universal jurisdiction. But you also have, this idea that there is a responsibility to protect, and what should the United Nations international community be doing in a situation like this is they should be acting on the responsibility to protect and taking steps to try and stop what is happening there. I'm not talking military intervention. That's like a very far level down the road, but all of the other steps that they can take, such as sanctions, such as arms embargoes, such as shutting them out of the banking system, anything that they can do, they should now be doing to try and bring every bit of pressure they can to bear on the military to step down.
What's your sense about the military? I mean, they are seeing a situation perhaps they haven't seen before, because in previous years, probably by now, they would have dealt with any kind of insurrection or rebellion or protest. But this is not going anywhere. Have they backed themselves into a corner to a point where they say, we have to play it out now, we can't back down, it's too late?
That is the risk. They clearly did not anticipate the level of opposition that they have received. They did not anticipate that they would have so many people out in the streets who would be willing to continue coming out into the streets in the face of the kind of violence inflicted by the security forces. And the thing they really didn't anticipate is the civil defense movement, where you have so many of the employees of the railroads and the banks and all of the other that make the country run saying, work for you. They are essentially shutting down and wrecking the economy intentionally in order to get the junta out of power. And this is something that the military doesn't know how to deal with. You can't force people, they can try and force people to work. You can't really force people to go do their jobs. You can shoot at protesters in the street, but what do you do when your train drivers won't come to work? What they have been doing is things like forcing them out of their housing that comes with their job and doing other things to try and make them go back to work. But they did not anticipate this. And I think they're resorting to the only thing they know, which is violence.
Can you envisage a future where the military is apolitical in Myanmar? I mean, given the history and the nature of the beast that we're dealing with, but it does seem that the people have had enough. But one can't even almost imagine what Myanmar would look like without military influence.
The problem is that the military is making a lot of money. The military is very deeply involved in businesses, in extractive industries, jade and timber and oil and gas. And that money, they don't want to give up. So by getting out of governance, giving up their ability to control and to have access to many of those resources. And so I think that's one of the factors that is, driving them to be so resistant. But it's very clear that the people of Myanmar are calling for a government that does not include the military. There's been a lot of calls by a lot of different groups to essentially tear up the 2008 Constitution, which is the Constitution written by the military that gives them an outsized role in government even before you had a military. They had 25% of the seats in parliament and control of three, significant, powerful ministries. So it's definitely what most people in the country are making clear they want. It is, as you say, difficult to imagine what look like and get.
All right, Linda Lakhdhir, legal advisor in the Asia Division of Human Rights Watch. Thank you so much indeed for joining us and giving us some valuable insights in this tragedy that's playing out in Myanmar. And one hopes that a sense of urgency might be felt at the highest bodies such as the UN Security Council in dealing with these issues. Thank you so much indeed for your time.